Bet the Board podcast powered by FanDuel Sportsbook. A little college football on the docket this week, and as we continue to navigate through the month of November, the playoff picture starts to offer a little bit more clarity. I'm your host, Todd Furman, joined as always by my esteemed colleague and co-host, the one, the only Payne Insider. And as we always do to kick things off, encourage you to go to FanDuel.com/BetTheBoard. Take advantage of all the new user sign-up bonuses that FanDuel has made available to you, whether it's a $1,000 risk-free bet, whether it's 30-1 enhanced odds for some of the marquee NFL games for the given week. FanDuel wants to let you get your money to work for you this weekend. And Payne, we got another reveal of the college football playoff committee rankings last night. I don't think there were any surprises. I'm not even sure it begs us taking time out of our busy day to discuss them.
I completely agree. And even though Cincinnati didn't look very good against Tulsa, they are in position to be in the Final Four if things shake out the way they could. So I don't think it's even worthy of getting irate at where Cincinnati is this week. I guess the only debate is Michigan State, which played each other 2 weeks ago. But I understand the thought process of the committee. It actually, crazily, is forward thinking, right? Like they're like, Michigan went on the road and was up 30-14 3 quarters into the game. And I understand the final result, but if you look at the box score, Michigan probably was a little bit better in that game. And so the thought process actually made sense that we aren't just the victim to head-to-head, although when you do have one loss each, head-to-head probably should come into play. But it's difficult. I think we're lined up, though, where this is going to play out without some funny business from the looks of things.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that goes into that is that you had the Big Ten issue an apology to Michigan for some blown calls in that game. So I think the committee could use that as a crutch, saying, though, if the officials hadn't botched some of those key situations that Michigan might have come out on top. But the simple reality of it is this: Michigan will earn their way in, Michigan State will earn their way in, or they'll both fall victim to Ohio State in coming weeks and make all of that discussion moot. One thing I will add, FanDuel Sportsbook, of course, has odds, yes, no's on a lot of these teams to make the college football playoff. We know Georgia, an overwhelming favorite, put up $24 to make one at minus 2,400. Alabama right now is listed at a pick'em, and apparently, I have a very vocal Alabama fan in the mix. Alabama listed at a pick'em at minus $1.10. I do think that builds in a little bit of math as far as the potential that Alabama could be included with 2 losses. What I think is fascinating, though, and why you always have to try and put your money in the best position, is with a team like Oklahoma that is minus 175 to make the college football playoff. You're going to get more bang for your buck with a money line rollover, and there's no scenario that I see where the Sooners can get into the playoff if they were to lose one of their final remaining 4 games.
No, they have to win the rest of the way, and the schedule is certainly difficult over the coming weeks. And so that becomes a little bit of a gauntlet. Hopefully things change out of the bye. Defense gets a little bit healthier. But Oklahoma is going to have to run the table. That's clear, just based on where they're positioned within the committee rankings.
And I think it's a perfect place to start when you look at Oklahoma, who has a chance to get their first resume-building win of the entire college football season. I mean, we've joked about teams playing soft schedules leading up to it, but Oklahoma's resume leaves a lot to be desired. We'll see what they can accomplish this weekend in Waco, where it's Oklahoma listed as a 5.5-point road favorite to take on the Baylor Bears. Total in this game, 62.5 at FanDuel Sportsbook. Assuming Baylor remains ranked, this will be the first team inside the college football, well, assuming they are ranked, inside the college football playoff top 25 that OU has played all season. When you look at the Sooners, this is a program that's won 28 of its last 30 games on the road since 2014. Meanwhile, the Bears, no slouch in their own building, and it's a credit to what Dave Aranda has been able to do, going 5-0 at home, 17-5 the last 22 overall. Oklahoma has obviously dominated this series, winning 28 out of the last 31 against Baylor. You mentioned Oklahoma coming into this game off of a bye. Caleb Williams has really given this offense a shot in the arm. We saw a Baylor team I think both you and I thought was vastly overrated, finally stub its toe, losing outright as a 7-point favorite last weekend against TCU. But when you look at this particular matchup, Payne, are you as intrigued to see if Oklahoma can completely stymie Baylor's offensive attack, or if the Sooners will be able to attack this Bears defense in space early and often?
I think there's so many interesting elements to this game. Let's start with Oklahoma and Caleb Williams, who you mentioned, is obviously given the Sooners offense a little shot in the arm. He's certainly been the dual threat the offense needs, right? When you think about how it's operated the last few seasons with guys like Kyler and Jalen Hurts, having that added element of the legs takes the offense to a new level. If you look across the board, whether it's down to down or being explosive, the Sooners do everything great. You know, you look at them top 10 in passing success rate and EPA per pass, top 15 in rushing success rate and EPA per rush. And so it's just a nice balance, especially when you have Caleb. What is interesting here is we know Dave Aranda is a defensive genius. I think we can kind of label him that at this point. But in year two, the talent level isn't quite where he wants it to be, so there are some holes defensively. Secondary appears to be a bit of an issue. So Caleb Williams could have success there. Baylor is outside the top 70 in both EPA per pass allowed and passing success rate. And you kind of take it one step further and actually look at the games where Baylor's faced better passing attacks. It's Iowa State and then last week against TCU. Both those passing attacks are top 25 in either passing success or EPA per pass, okay? That's kind of the bucket you would put those two offenses in. Iowa State put up 0.54 EPA per pass. That is well above the national average. And then TCU with a quarterback in Chandler Morris that wasn't good enough to play for Lincoln Riley, transferred out of Oklahoma, and then put up 0.94 EPA per pass against Baylor's secondary. So on paper, there is advantages for the Sooners offense, especially through the air. When you think rested, off a bye, probably a wrinkle or two or something that hasn't been shown on film yet. Now, what's really interesting is sometimes when you look at sports betting, and we talk about this all the time, Todd, X's and O's matter, obviously. And I have said for the longest time, if you can kind of perfect the trio, if you're building a group to bet games, you find a numbers guy, you find an information guy, and then you have an X's and O's guy. And games where those three elements all line up and match seem to be the strongest with the largest edge that I have seen in my years of doing this.
100%.
And so you do start to wonder if Dave Aranda's found something schematically against Lincoln Riley. If you go back to 2019, you had the semifinal where LSU crushed Oklahoma, and it wasn't just because Joe Burrow and LSU's offense was historically good. Dave Aranda held Lincoln Riley and Jalen Hurts to 14 points the first 40 minutes of the game. And then in year one at Baylor last year on the road, Aranda holds Oklahoma to a 38% offensive success rate with a negative EPA per play. Sooners had 17 points the first 47 minutes of that game. So maybe there is something X's and O's that's beyond us, Todd, just kind of looking at matchups and things of that nature. So that'll be interesting to see because he has just shown very well against Lincoln Riley in the last two meetings. I think the other thing worth mentioning here, Todd, and I know there isn't an official answer, so I'm not going to put you on the spot, but if you poke around the interwebs, you poke around on Twitter, Lincoln Riley missed his presser yesterday, and it's not for the reason LSU fans think it's for.
No, you're right. It was a good point, and it was something I found a little bit odd. Not only did he miss his press conference without an explanation from the university, he also missed his coach's show, and they claimed that it was a family medical situation. They've used all sorts of different spin on this. I think we'll get a lot more information later today, but there is always a chance, given the times that we live in now, that Lincoln may or may not be available for Saturday's game, and I'm not going to make that implication here. I'll let our listeners take away some of that conclusion. And if Lincoln isn't traveling with the team or for whatever reason should miss the game this weekend, I think it changes the dynamic of what this team is able to do, adjusting on the fly from an offensive capabilities. Now, as we record Wednesday morning, hey, look, we could be throwing this out there. He could be back with the team for practice, and all of the speculation could be for naught. But I definitely think as you get closer to the game and you're trying to figure out one of the marquee matchups of the weekend, you definitely have to build that into the handicapping a little bit. And if Lincoln isn't there, Payne, it puts a lot more pressure on Alex Grinch and this defense to try and slow down a Baylor offense that has operated in fits and spurts, but we know the key to Baylor's offensive attack this year has been Abram Smith, who doesn't get enough credit for what he's meant to the Baylor ground game. He's putting up numbers on the same level as Kenneth Walker. And I think if you're Oklahoma, you've had 2 weeks to prepare. If you can make Baylor one-dimensional, you'll take your chances that Gary Bohannon's not beating you through the air with the passing game.
what was really interesting is in Dave Aranda's post-game presser against TCU, he was basically already moved on. He flat out said, we're going to focus on finding a way to move the ball on the ground for all 4 quarters against Oklahoma. And it's not surprising. Gary Bohannon turned it over twice last week. You obviously have 2 great backs in Abram and Ebner. Aranda wants the run game to kind of be the identity of the offense. And it makes a ton of sense, right? Like Baylor's top 12 in both rushing success rate and EPA per rush. Plus, he's a defensive-minded coach. So it kind of is what he wants to be at this point. Now, we talk all the time about game planning for opponent each week. Running isn't really how you want to attack Oklahoma. The Sooners are 9th in EPA per rush allowed, 129th in EPA per pass allowed. Now, you can have some success running on Oklahoma here and there. They're not a complete brick wall. They don't recruit defensive linemen at the rate other teams in that top 5 or 6 programs do. And because of that, Oklahoma down to down, their run defense isn't really elite. 64th in rushing success rate allowed, outside the top 30 in defensive line yards, 44th in stuff rate. But the point is, the Sooners secondary can be had. Ideally, when you are facing Oklahoma, the point of attack should be through the air. I'm interested to see what Alex Grinch comes up with off the bye. And all signs point to Oklahoma's secondary getting a little bit healthier. We saw that trend kind of in the right direction prior to the bye. You had DJ Graham, you had Turner Yell return against Texas Tech. That allowed Grinch to move Key Lawrence from safety to corner. It does sound like Woody Washington is more doubtful than probable based on Lincoln Riley's comments about him not getting in any team reps at practice. This was over the weekend. So it would be a nice get back, Woody Washington. I'm just not sure he's ready for this one. But what is really interesting here, I would think when you're looking at this and you see an Oklahoma secondary that's 129th in pass defense, I would expect some improvement there based upon the prep and the rest and the injury situation improving a little bit. I think the real thing to watch for in this side of the ball, and it's talked about so much more now because I think of podcasts like this, obviously, and there's a lot of guys that have been innovative with their analytics. It's early downs, right? That's awesome if you're great on third down. It's a variance stat. If you're relying upon that, it's very difficult to have that be one of like the leading predictors of outcomes. It's just very difficult. Chances when you look at this, of this week-to-week improvement from Oklahoma's defense, it's kind of showing signs of some improvement there. You do like what you saw against Texas Tech. Obviously, there was a coaching situation that week. But when I look at this, Baylor's offense, 12th in early down EPA. Oklahoma, 106th in early down defensive EPA allowed. So if that continues, suddenly our question mark at the top, Todd, and Gary Bohannon won't really have to throw often in these known passing situations because he's a guy that, he's uber talented, right? He's big, he's mobile, he's got a cannon for an arm. He has really high highs, very low lows. And if you look at Baylor's offense, they're elite on standard downs when defenses have to defend run and pass. 57% success rate on that down. Very damn good. But they dip to 30% on passing downs, which is below the national average. So Oklahoma has to do a good enough job against the run to make Bohannon a passer in known situations. If Oklahoma can do that, then I think, a much healthier secondary with good talent proves that they're not, 129th in the country. I think that's what this comes down to. Go back to the Iowa State game. And I know Baylor won that. I think we've outlined that game, how Baylor's offense kind of shocked Iowa State, putting stuff, on the field that wasn't on tape the first 2 games. Then all of a sudden, once Iowa State figured it out, they surged back. Bohannon had a 0% success rate passing on passing downs from the second quarter onward in that game. So it's clear it's not Bohannon's strength passing in these known passing situations, but to get him in those, you have to stop the run.
Yeah, it's a heck of a lot easier when you have the full playbook at your disposal on 3rd and 1 and 3rd and 2 versus 3rd and 7 and 3rd and 8, even when you're playing in your own building. And there's no doubt that Baylor got their wake-up call last week. We'll see if Oklahoma can meet the bell right out of the gates, knowing that they still have the world in front of them over the next 3 weeks of the regular season. From the Big 12 to the SEC, Texas A&M goes on the road to Oxford, Mississippi to take on the Rebels. You're looking at Texas A&M, a 2.5-point road favorite at FanDuel Sportsbook. Total on the game sits at 55.5, and the Aggies, they put their flag in the ground last week from a defensive standpoint. They held a top 25 team without a touchdown for the first time since 2010, completely shutting down what Auburn wanted to do in the run and the pass. Meanwhile, Ole Miss, they built a 24-0 lead over Liberty. They held on for dear life with a 27-14 decision. Malik Willis tried his best to get the Flames into the back door, to no avail late. When you look at Ole Miss, they've now won 7 straight home games dating back to last season, the third longest active home winning streak in the SEC behind Alabama and Georgia. But Payne, when you look at this Ole Miss team in its current iteration, it is a far cry from the explosive offenses that we've seen earlier in the season due to some injuries at skill positions. As far as wide receivers concerned, they're banged up on the offensive line, and in comes Texas A&M, arguably the best defense that Ole Miss has faced all season long.
You are spot on. Obviously, Ole Miss's offense is not playing at peak right now with all the injuries they're dealing with. And when you're a team that's led by offense, and offense is 4 times more valuable than defense, you do have to make a real adjustment to the Rebels. Dontario Drummond and Mingo missed last week. The latter is definitely out again. Let's keep an eye on Drummond. Starting guard, as you mentioned, Ben Brown is out. The left guard, Caleb Warren, is battling through an injury. Orlando Umana, the starting center, has a serious hand injury that he's playing through as well. Braylon Sanders returned last week, still working his way back, played 14 passing snaps, averaged almost 5 yards per route run. Awesome. You would think his workload would increase, and then Lane Kiffin came out and said, I watched the film. He's not close to 100%. And then obviously the engine of the offense, and Matt Corral, hasn't been close to 100%, injured after the 30-carry Tennessee game, re-injured the ankle again against Auburn, left on a cart, got shot up, returned.
Allegedly shot up, Payne. Allegedly shot up.
Okay. I've never seen anyone carted off that couldn't walk and then magically reappeared. So, I mean, he's kind of been a shell of himself. Basically became a pocket quarterback against Liberty, which was possible because of the class difference. Corral was only pressured on 15% of his dropbacks. That's obviously going to change a little bit against an A&M front that rotates, 5-6 guys that are all 4-star and better. A&M's defensive line, when you look at it right now, they're able to be interchangeable, which was interesting last week, right? They have like the big 330-pound guy that you can put in there against an offense that wants to run, or you can lighten the box and go with a little bit more athletic front. That's just kind of how Jimbo recruits, and that didn't change last week, right? 30 minutes before kickoff, he lands the number 1 defensive lineman in the country. So, Jimbo's got talent. And so I think that could present some issues for Ole Miss, obviously, because while they're a veteran offensive line, they are injured, and they're not like the biggest, baddest, most athletic offensive line. So that is something to look for in this game. When you look at A&M, they do a great job stuffing runs, 23% stuff rate. That's 25th in the country. So the ground game might be void a little bit for Ole Miss. The real fun matchup in this game, obviously, is Mike Elko, who is becoming an all-world defensive coordinator, probably going to get a job at some point, and then you have the offensive minds like Kiffin and Levy. You kind of look at this matchup. Ole Miss wants to kind of spread you out, so you're forced to identify your defense. And then once they spread you out, you have to defend the entire field. They put you in conflict with the RPO game. A&M saw this. And, when we broke down Ole Miss Arkansas, we're like, Jesus, this is the mirror image bowl. But A&M saw this style of offense back in week 4. They obviously lost that game. And I think you'll hear it referenced all week as to why Texas A&M's defense could struggle or Ole Miss will have success, is that they struggled against Arkansas. But I think there's 2 realities. And the first is Texas A&M, top 7 in both passing success rate and EPA per pass allowed. So this is a very good secondary, despite what you're going to, I think, hear based upon people wanting to kind of drum this up as a monster game or whatever it may be. I don't get it. The second reason is the big picture number of Arkansas putting up 246 passing yards against A&M, and this idea that A&M really struggled. And I think, let's keep things fair. There were moments where Arkansas put A&M in conflict and A&M overran plays and A&M missed tackles. I do think a lot of that gets cleaned up. But if you remove the 85-yard explosive from Jefferson to Traylon Burks from the entire equation. KJ Jefferson completed 43% of his passes for 127 yards. There was basically 4 explosives that changed the entire dynamic of that game, one of which was a trick play. Past the first quarter of that game, Arkansas had a 33% success rate in the second quarter. They went into halftime, made some adjustments. They came out with a 29% success rate in the third quarter and then a 33% success rate in the fourth quarter. Far from dominant, despite looking at like, oh my God, Arkansas threw for almost 250 yards on A&M's defense. That just kind of wasn't the vibe of the entire situation. It was just a couple explosives. So it comes down to A&M having eye discipline, being disciplined tacklers in space. But this is a game where receivers matter because they're operating space, they're operating one-on-one. And you just wonder if you're going into this fight, Todd, with your third, fourth, and fifth best pass catchers for Ole Miss, if those guys can consistently win their one-on-one matchups against A&M.
When you mention A&M, and I think not only in that game, but they've been prone to bust in the past. They've obviously cleaned things up a little bit in the back. I'm curious to see when you talk about how multiple A&M can be on the defensive front, if Ole Miss is able to establish pace and tempo, what that'll look like for A&M in terms of getting guys in and out of various situations. So it'll be interesting because when you dig into Ole Miss's rushing numbers, they've actually been better running the football this year than they have throwing, giving all the injuries to the wide receivers. Problem was last week, if you back out Jerry and Ely's big carry against Liberty, they were pretty pedestrian on that side of the game as well. So if that's the case here and they're put into known passing situations, I think that'll bode well for what this A&M defense wants to be able to do. Pin its ears back, drop 7 into coverage, and be able to create short fields and let their defensive backs play downhill. Now, it's a very efficient run game, especially when you had Corral, right? And now all of a sudden, he's probably not going to use his legs as much. So when you have that RPO attack, and it's, hey, at the mesh point, is Corral going to hold on to this and take off, or is it going to be a handoff? You can kind of cheat running back a little bit more in those situations, but you're right. It's been a very efficient ground game. The key to the tempo working, though, and not allowing A&M to, substitute their defensive linemen, you got to pick up a couple first downs to go tempo. And so that'll ultimately be key, is can the drive actually get started here? Exactly, and I honestly think if you're Texas A&M, Mike Elko should gamble early on and dare Matt Corral to carry the ball. Take away the running backs.
Completely agree.
Make him show that he's willing and able as a runner, and if he displays that element that we saw that made him so valuable against Tennessee, okay, then you adjust your defense after the opening drive. But if Corral doesn't appear to be that guy that can provide a legitimate threat in the box, it's going to make defending this team that much easier. On the other side, when you look at the Ole Miss defense, this is a bend but don't break unit. I'm not telling anybody something that they already don't know. They've given up more than 50% of the available offensive yards against their opponents this season. Only 13% of opponent drives grade out explosive, but 56% of them pick up at least 2 first downs. That's got to be music to the ears of Texas A&M and what they want to do, establishing 2 very capable running backs, taking the ball out of Zach Calzada's hands. And what was interesting in watching the game against Auburn, Calzada came out throwing the ball exceptionally well, went into a lull, wasn't exactly helped by the receiving core, but appears to feel much more comfortable. I just think it's Jimbo going, you know what? We want to run the ball first and foremost. We'll throw when absolutely necessary. This kind of defense should be one that they're able to exploit.
Calzada looks like a functioning quarterback now. There is no doubt. If you look at his feet in the pocket, substantially better than when we saw him thrown into the fire against Colorado. Obviously, Mike Elko's defense is the reason A&M beat Auburn last week, but Calzada, to your point, performed substantially better than Bo Nix, and there was a massive dichotomy on passing downs where Calzada was substantially better than Bo Nix. That was also a large reason A&M won. All signs point to A&M's O-line improving a little bit during this 4-game win streak. There was a shift made personnel-wise at both guard spots. This does feel like a week where Spiller and Ochne both have monster days, and you hit it perfectly. And we've talked a lot of Ole Miss football this year, and obviously for a good reason, but that reason ain't defense. And so, you're looking at Ole Miss's ability to stop the run here. They're not very good at that. Part of it is a little bit scheme. Part of it is not having the horses up front. Either way you slice it, Ole Miss 123rd in defensive line yards. Rebels have stuffed less than 14% of runs at or behind the line of scrimmage, so they rarely get you behind the down and distance. 112th in that category. All told, Ole Miss 126th in rushing success rate allowed. And that is the reason they give up a lot of successful and productive drives, as you mentioned. They give up the gashers, 2 on the ground, 122nd EPA per rush. And because they can't stop the run, it's a defense that's just inside the top 120 in early down EPA allowed. So I would expect Spiller and Ochne to hit some explosives, both right now, nearing a 21% explosive run rate on the season. Ole Miss is also one of the 10 worst defenses in the country in allowing teams to bypass third downs. And so that'll be something to look for in this game, because Calzada's made improvements, as I mentioned, but he's not like great by any stretch. And if you look at some of his passing numbers, whether it's completed balls or incomplete balls, his true accuracy is 55%. Still owns a 79 passer rating. At the college level, that's not very good. So he is certainly grown. He is not the total zero that we thought he was when he was inserted in the Colorado game and thereafter. Jimbo's done a good job coaching him up. His confidence has grown a little bit. When you beat Alabama, that's going to happen. But the only way to actually get Calzada to be a factor in this game is if Ole Miss is kind of willing to change what they do defensively. The rush 3, drop 8 approach is not going to work here. You're going to have to put more guys in the box. And you're going to have to make Calzada throw from uncomfortable down and distances. And what's really interesting is if you look at Ole Miss, the one area where they have shown well defensively is getting to the quarterback in known passing situations. They're actually number 1 in the country in passing down sack rate. So that is obviously the key here, but you're going to have to change things schematically to stop this ground game. And so that becomes obviously the big question. I don't know if they can do that. You also have to keep an eye on Sam Williams. He was in and out of the Liberty game late with the hip injury. You could make the case that he has been the second most important Ole Miss player behind Matt Corral. So something to keep an eye on there in the front 7 as well. Did you see Jimbo's comments this week? He was pissing, moaning, and bitching about SEC officials this week. I do wonder how that works for him with the whistle this week, but something maybe to consider here in this game. But all signs point to A&M being able to run the ball here unless Ole Miss is going to make a drastic change with how they elect to defend things.
You know, it's one thing that we've seen in college football. Typically, ground games travel a lot better than passing games in this day and age. So I think Texas A&M going out on the road, even in a hostile territory, is built for this kind of opponent. Last thing on this game, Payne, wanted to get your take on the number with A&M below that key number of 3. Obviously, the Aggies need a little bit of help, but still a little bit of an outside chance to get into the college football playoff if they win out and Alabama were to stub its toe against either Arkansas or Auburn. When you look at how the market is pricing A&M, fair or foul, given their upward trajectory in recent weeks?
It's a very good question. The number certainly would not trigger a play on A&M. In fact, if it got to 3, there would be value on Ole Miss. The problem is the matchup is not very good. And you really have to start to figure out how you make your manual adjustments in some of the priors, because Ole Miss's offense is not what it was 3-4 weeks ago. You know, as I kind of mentioned at the top there, it's like offense is 4 times more valuable than defense. And now you have a quarterback that is kind of hobbling around out there. I wouldn't call him, 50%, but I'm sure he is, 70% at this point. And you have a receiver group that in a game like this that's going to see a lot of man coverage, going to have to win their battles. And you have basically last week was your number 1 receiver was a converted quarterback. So you have to make that adjustment. So if you have all your priors in from this year, you're going to see value on Ole Miss, but you have to kind of adjust manually. And so I think 2.5 is probably the right number on A&M.
Should be a hell of a game to watch from the Grove on Saturday night at 7:30 Eastern. Earlier in the day, though, the Big Ten pecking order will help hopefully be determined a little bit when Michigan goes into Beaver Stadium to take on Penn State. This game right now, FanDuel Sportsbook, a pick'em. Total on the contest sits at 48.5. When you look at 5 of the last 6 between these teams have gone over the total. Last year's game, the exception there, with the first half coming in over, but the full game cashing an under ticket. When you look at Michigan, they're seeking just their second win at Beaver Stadium since 2006. Michigan does come into this contest off a 20-point victory. They've had 6 this year, the most in conference. Nebraska and Michigan State are the only 2 teams to score 20-plus against the Wolverines defense. When you look at Michigan, though, I mean, we know the trials and tribulations that Coach Harbaugh has suffered through at the helm in terms of beating ranked opponents, especially on the road. It hasn't exactly been a great recipe for success. But I think, Payne, when you begin to dissect this matchup, Michigan's defense, I think we all have a pretty good idea of what it is. We know Penn State's not really going to commit to running the football. We saw Jahan Dotson go absolutely bonkers last weekend at Maryland. You wouldn't have known that going into the fourth quarter, though, where Penn State had accumulated a grand total of 10 points. But this is a Michigan offense that we've seen flash from the passing attack. We know they want to ground and pound. How do things look as far as Michigan matching up offensively against the Penn State defensive front?
I think the first thing is figuring out how healthy Cade McNamara is. And the quote that I found from Harbaugh was simply, he's in a much better place this week than he was last week. So I would anticipate McNamara being the guy. Feels like Michigan fans want to expedite the J.J. McCarthy experience, and I'm just looking at him, and I comprehend that he's a 5-star kid, and he's got more talent than McNamara, and he's more mobile, and so fans want him out there, but we saw what that looked like against Michigan State, and McCarthy also came in against Indiana and completed 50% of his passes and threw a pick and had a 27 passer rating. So I am sure we will see McCarthy a little bit here, but this is not the spot for him having a large role unless McNamara gets re-injured. I don't really think Penn State's secondary is elite. We've talked about this. They can be had 39th in passing success rate allowed, and they've faced a really bad schedule of passing offenses. PSU has done a nice job limiting explosive passes, but if you look at Maryland last week, Baby Tua did a good job manufacturing down-to-down efficiency. Without the normal cast of Maryland weapons, to a 13.2 total passing EPA. I'm not sure Michigan has the weapons. That, I think, is the big question. We know Bell went down early in the season. He was their best receiver. And then kind of if you're reading the tea leaves, it doesn't sound great for Blake Corum to play this week. He was injured on the first carry against Indiana, returned to the sideline in a boot. His running mate there, Haskins, told the media that he spoke with Corum, and Corum told him he'd be back soon. Doesn't necessarily sound like a guy playing this week. So you lose the lightning part of the running back duo, and one that I think is probably, just kind of looking at the roster, one of your better pass catching options out of the backfield if Corum can't go. So that would be a pretty big loss, especially when you think about some of the explosiveness. Eric All, I know we discussed this off air, Todd. He's Michigan's best tight end. He didn't play last week. He was dressed out, though. We'll have to keep an eye on his status. He caught 84% of his targets and averaged 2.2 yards per route run this season. So that would be a nice option to have back for Michigan's offense. But kind of where I'm going with this is, Michigan's passing offense, I don't know if they have enough talent-wise to consistently move it through the air, even though Penn State can be a little vulnerable there, even though the metrics might not indicate it. So it comes down to bully ball, to your point. And Michigan should have the advantage in the trenches there. Penn State, 69th in rushing success rate allowed, 51st in EPA per rush allowed. They've had some injuries to the defensive line, especially on the interior. We've seen Penn State get manhandled by Illinois. Wisconsin beat them up a little bit. You had the Bigsby-Jarquez duo. They showed out pretty well for Auburn. And then you had Travion Henderson. Boy, he had a day against PSU. I think the thing we have to kind of assess here is if McNamara isn't 100% and Corum's out and it just becomes Haskins in the bowling ball role, we'll call it, Penn State's just going to load the box. And so it becomes pretty difficult to see a path for a ton of offensive success from Michigan here. listen, college football's been kind of bizarre this season. This is a tough game for me to assess. The line clearly says Penn State's the side. But I don't really love either team. And I'm looking at Michigan and Penn State. They're both in my top 8. I don't think either of them are nearly as good compared to other teams we've had that high in recent years. And you kind of, just kind of look at the entire landscape here. And Michigan's defense even, like they've played 2 offenses with a pulse, not even great offenses, giving up 66 points in those games. We outlined in the Michigan State game, Todd, Aiden Hutchinson's greatness is skewing the perception of the entire Wolverines defense. And if you listen to the podcast, and I know a lot of you guys take notes as you listen, if you've done that, the one key factor in this game is Mike Yurcich, Penn State's offensive coordinator. He likes to play with pace and tempo. Penn State is top 20 in pace. We know Michigan struggled against that. Sparty caught them multiple times going tempo. That's something to look for here, but Penn State doesn't really have an ability to run the ball. So there's just so many weird things. I also can't figure out Penn State, to your point. I have no clue what they are. And we're 10 weeks into the season. They beat Wisconsin on the road, but lost convincingly in the box score. You get the late goal line stand against Auburn for a win at home. You lose to Iowa, but would have won it had Sean Clifford not left with an injury. Somehow you lose to Illinois off the bye as a 24-point home favorite. Then you battle Ohio State to the wire. Everything looks great, to your point, Todd, against Maryland last week. Win by 17 as a 10-point road favorite. Then you actually dig into the game and you see, of all the games last week, Penn State had the largest negative differential and success rate of a winning team. Penn State was a net negative 18% in success rate last week. Now, just again, the number says Penn State. They're certainly the healthier team, it would appear. There are some matchup advantages that they could have through the air, potentially loading the box because Michigan isn't really a threat in the passing game with an injured quarterback and not a ton of weapons. And there were some other guys, right, that you listed that we talked about off air that Michigan has some injury question marks with.
Yeah, I mean, this is a team that's banged up pretty much everywhere. I mean, coming out of the last couple of weeks, you talked about Cade McNamara potentially being healthier, tight end Eric All, who missed the game against Indiana. We've mentioned Blake Corum. Donovan Edwards also nicked up, another depth running back. A.J. Henning, Andrell Anthony, he of the big pass play against Michigan State. And they're also dealing with injuries on the defensive side of the ball as well. Although I did find it interesting that Coach Harbaugh, when talking about the Green brothers, said these two have better healing qualities than almost any college football player he's been around. So whatever they're doing, I'm always happy to take a holistic type approach to recovering from injuries because pain, as you know, well, you don't know, but inching closer to 40, there's a good chance you could sprain your ankle getting out of bed in the morning just walking to the bathroom.
I think why Harbaugh mentioned that is he's a fan that the Green brothers also ascribe to the whole milk. And so that's probably why they heal so well.
Hey, one question I did want to ask, because you have enough data for Penn State to believe it's not an outlier this late in the season, but when you're number 2 in the country in terms of green zone defense, allowing your opponents just 2.2 points every trip they get inside the 40, do you think that's as much skill? Is that a little bit of variance? Is it a combination of factors? How do you look at some of those metrics when you only have 2 or 3 games of the season left to go?
Yeah, it's certainly, I would say, somewhat skill-based, right? A lot of teams play bend but don't break. They're able to hunker down a little bit. But what's interesting is typically, as space shrinks, teams that can run the ball will typically give you fits if you can't stop the run. So that is kind of Penn State's weakness. And so that's what I think is most interesting about it is if you can't stop the run and you're good in that category, maybe there is some noise to that. And obviously, again, it's just a 10-week sample size. But at this point, you do have to give them credit. Maybe it's something they're doing schematically. Maybe that's when they start to load the box and they feel better with their corners on islands. You also, again, look at the schedule that they faced. Not a ton of great quarterbacks, not a ton of great passing offenses. So once they get down there in that confined space and there's not enough room to operate, I think that is partially why they're good in that area.
Yeah, you're definitely not throwing the ball into tight windows with road Bo Nix early in September. That's for damn sure. The dynamic changes a little bit. But as you talk about it, teams haven't been in that situation where they have to throw. And I also do wonder on some level how some of the overtime metrics against Illinois are actually built into some of that as well, given the ineptitude we saw from plays coming from the 2-yard line. All right, to the ACC.
Look at the quarterbacks they faced, though.
Oh, it's not good.
I mean, just across the board, it's a second and third string quarterback for Indiana. It is like Road Bo Nix before he knew he was actually decent on the road. And, Graham Mertz and, Villanova and Ball State and, it's Iowa's offense. It's just it's not very good, right? I mean, Arthur Sikowski. It's Maryland without, its top receivers. Obviously, again, you showed well against Ohio State, and some of it is schematically, but it's also a large byproduct of not facing good quarterbacks and passing offenses.
How dare you speak poorly of the pride of Ball State, their starting quarterback, Drew Plitt, who has struggled mightily all season long in the Cardinals' quest to win the MAC West. All right, ACC country brings us to Winston-Salem, where Wake Forest will welcome in NC State. You're looking at Wake, a 2.5-point favorite on the FanDuel Sportsbook. Total in this game sits at 66.5. Saturday marks the 115th time that NC State and Wake Forest will play one another in football. They've played every single year since 1910, and yet this marks just the second time they're meeting as a pair of top 25 teams. Massive game, obviously, in the pecking order for the Atlantic Division. Wake could potentially have a 2-game lead with Clemson and BC left to play if they were victorious on Saturday. Meanwhile, NC State would be in a tie, but have tiebreakers over Wake and Clemson with Syracuse and UNC left on their docket. When you look at how things have gone for Wake Forest, we knew they weren't as good as their resume suggested. It's what led us to betting North Carolina last week as our best bet in a game where we needed a little bit of a comeback late. That game clearly shifted when Wake Forest dealt with some injuries to the secondary. Carson, Gavin Holmes forced Wake Forest to play patchwork and more or less conservatively, if you believe Dave Clawson's comments, said it made the team more susceptible to the run. Well, no indication that those guys are going to be anywhere close to 100% this week. We're not sure of the status, at least right now, of Christian Beal-Smith for that Wake Forest offense. But when you look at some of this game and you try and figure out how the game is going to go, I don't want to make it overly simplistic, Payne, but if we're talking about strength on strength, it's Sam Hartman and this Wake Forest offense with a very talented receiving core against an NC State defense that'll be the first legitimate test that the Deacons have faced all season long.
You are spot on. Good on good here. You have Sam Hartman and a Wake Forest passing attack that's top 10. You have an NC State defense that's allowed less than 33% of passes to grade successful. So, something has to give here. I think everyone knows I'm a huge Sam Hartman guy. I like everything about him. Obviously, not the most talented quarterback you'll ever see, but he can play the position. He works hard. He helped build a crap high school program, doing it again at Wake Forest. Great kid, came to school at 175 pounds. They mentioned this on the broadcast last week, now up to 210 pounds, which now he becomes a dual threat. 5 straight games with a rushing touchdown in those 5 games. 7 total rushing touchdowns for Hartman. And I really think, and you would know this better than I would, if Wake runs the table here, I think Sam Hartman deserves to be in the Heisman conversation. I really do. When you look at some of the metrics, 4th best QBR in the country, 5th in EPA per play. I mean, he's really doing it all for that offense. I like the receiver duo there you have with Roberson and Perry. Both are on pace for over 1,200 yards. Both are going to have double-digit touchdowns. And I think what's interesting here is if you look at who NC State's defense has played, the 3 best quarterbacks on the schedule, Will Rogers, Tyler Van Dyke, and Austin Kendall. NC State lost 2 of those games, and Austin Kendall ended with a positive 0.46 EPA per pass. The other 6 offenses NC State has played are FCS Furman, FSU with the backup quarterback.
How dare you?
And Boston College without Phil Yurkovich. And then it's South Florida, Clemson, and Louisville. Those 3 have an average rank of 100th in passing success rate and 85th in EPA per pass. So it's a little bit of a different ball game here. Wake Forest, 4th in EPA per pass. So big step up in class. You're doing it on the road. All signs point to NC State's Tyler Baker-Williams returning in the secondary. That is huge. He's graded out the Wolfpack's 3rd best defensive player. However, NC State's defense down 4 starters from opening day. They're really thin at linebacker. Peyton Willis, Isaiah Moore, both out for the year. That is likely an area of the field that you can attack with the pass game, right? Targeting backup linebackers, especially knowing the versatility that you lost with Cyrus Fagan when he went down early in the season. And then you start to think about how Wake's offense operates with
the
that
slow mesh.
elongated, RPO game, which puts your linebackers in conflict. That could be a problem. Savion Jackson, NC State starting defensive tackle, left the FSU game, didn't return, was seen after with a brace on his knee. Let's monitor that situation, but doesn't sound great. The injuries have piled up, right? And kind of when you assess that along with the competition, I don't think NC State's defense is nearly as good as what they appear to be on paper. The problem I'm having is my numbers show value in NC State, and I can see why the 3 was gobbled. One book even opened 3.5, which was wild. But our number makes this game more of like a pick'em. And if I'm keeping things fair, Wake Forest hasn't played a defense really either, even with some of the injuries accounted for. NC State, they've played one top 40 defense all season. That's Syracuse. That's it. So it's I don't really like this game. I think NC State's going to be the side. But I also don't believe their defense is good as what it appears metrically. It's just a very bizarre game for me, and a game where you're kind of just picking the winner. But I would expect possibly this game to trend towards pick'em where we made this game.
I'll also go one step further. I think when you look at the sidelines, Wake Forest has a decided advantage with Dave Clawson calling the shots there for the black and gold. No disrespect meant for Dave Dorn, but at the same time, I think Clawson, at some point in his career, when he chooses to leave Winston-Salem, is going to be a coach that should be highly coveted by a lot of the power programs, given what he's been able to accomplish with one of the smallest student bodies in the entire FBS year in, year out. It takes a lot to integrate the system. The problem for Wake every time they step up in class and face better athletes, oftentimes scheme can't typically overcome some of those deficiencies.
They just built him a new football facility, a football-only facility. I think he likes it there. And they have this process down pat where for what they are and who they are, they recruit okay, but they recruit players to the system. So the entire goal is, you'll notice, they redshirt a bunch of their freshmen and sometimes sophomore. And so you have this, they're kind of at the peak. Obviously, this is like the best Wake Forest team potentially of all time. But kind of how they're building this out is that they want to be able to compete by the time their guys are juniors, seniors, fifth-year seniors. And that's kind of what we're seeing. It's a very veteran group here for Wake Forest. But it's kind of this every couple years you are essentially rebuilding your process. And it's really fun to see. You would know the scholastic side of things, but Wake Forest, kind of maybe the Stanford of the East?
Elite. It's elite academically. There's no doubt about it, and it doesn't have the same ability to absorb some of those secondary kids like a school that's elite academically in North Carolina that still places a little bit more emphasis on athletics when you look at the student body size and everything else. There are a lot of schools throughout the ACC that don't get enough credit for academic merits, and I think Wake is one that if you're not familiar with the school, you don't understand how good it is from an academic side. And I think what they've done athletically, to your point, is that they have a strength and conditioning program. You talked about Sam Hartman being able to build himself up. You're not going to get the 5-star kids there necessarily, but if you have those 3- and 4-star kids that you can get to mature within the system, you're going to have those spurt years. And I also don't think that this is a Wake fan base that really believes they should be 10-2, 11-1 year in, year out, contending for ACC title. So if you're able to make it happen, every 5 to 6 years, it's a great step in the right direction. And Sam Hartman clearly taking on the mold of Riley Skinner before him, who I believe was the last Wake Forest starting quarterback that led them to a conference championship.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, Sam Hartman's been awesome for them. You really start to wonder what they would be without him when you look at kind of how things are constructed, but he's been fantastic. I hope he gets a Heisman invite.
Crazy to think, too, that, Hartman beat out Jamie Newman years ago when Newman was probably the more highly regarded recruit, and obviously never materialized at Wake, didn't quite achieve his potential at Georgia, and I'm not quite sure what Jamie Newman is up to at this point in his life.
Do you remember that, where he was like, he's going to go to Georgia, and he's got the potential to be a first-round quarterback? And I was like, what was I watching at Wake Forest that I missed that memo that he had the potential to be a first-round quarterback.
Well, they had talked about him going to Georgia, and they had talked about him going to the school we're about to discuss next, where I think he actually would have been a better fit if he was the guy leading the Oregon offense, given everything that he brought to the table, knowing that Mario Cristobal likes a downhill running style and Newman's athleticism mirrors some of what we've seen from Anthony Brown so far this season. So from the East Coast to the West Coast, a game that'll go a long way in defining the Pac-12 North, the Oregon Ducks, fresh off of their 26-16 win against the Washington Huskies in a rain-soaked Seattle last weekend, welcome in the Washington State Cougars, and you're looking at Oregon, nearly a 2-touchdown favorite, 13.5 at FanDuel Sportsbook. Total in the game sits at 57.5. To Oregon's credit, their defense was really the story of the day. They held Washington to less than 200 yards in the rain, the fewest yards they've allowed in a game since 2010. Things got so bad for Washington that they finally parted ways with their offense coordinator in John Donovan. The Jimmy Lake situation, I'm not even sure it's worth discussing. He won't be with the team this weekend when they play host to Arizona State. Meanwhile, on the flip side, Washington State very easily could have seen their season spiral away from them, but they've won 4 out of the last 5 after they started the season 1-3. Jaden DeLore has given them a little bit of stability at the quarterback spot, and the one thing when you read some of the local papers throughout Spokane is that the offensive line has truly been solidified in recent weeks. They've turned a corner with 7 rushing touchdowns over the last 3 games after accumulating only 5 rushing touchdowns in the previous 6 games, which will be a fun matchup to watch, knowing that Oregon is second in the conference in stopping the run. But Payne, I don't think that side of the ball is going to determine the outcome in this one whatsoever. It's more about a Washington State defense that's undersized in the trenches, going head-to-head against a physically imposing offensive line, and one that's found its true bell cow back in Travis Dye with a perfect complement in Brian Cardwell.
It's so wild that we're even discussing this game when you think about Washington State, but it's obviously very important. A loss removes Oregon from the playoff conversation. It has to. And it catapults Wazoo to the top of the Pac-12 North standings. Just nutty to think about based on where we have Wazoo power rated, just around the 60th best team in the country. That is what is at stake here, though, right? And you hit this perfectly. Anytime you're going to talk about Oregon, anytime you're going to break down one of their games, their ability to have not just offensive success, but for the entire game, it comes down to running the ball. This is who Mario Cristobal wants to be, former offensive lineman. He just wants to kick your butt. He wants to be physical at the point of attack. He wants to be able to run the ball. Oregon signed 10 blue-chip offensive linemen in the Cristobal era, which is just wild, but that's what he wants to be, and it's the program's kind of taking shape based upon its head coach. Even when you think about this for a second, right? They had Justin Herbert under center. 6th quarterback taken overall, probably should have been first. They passed less than 48% of the time with Justin Herbert.
I still blame Marcus Arroyo for that. I'm not even going to put all that responsibility on Mario Cristobal. I do have a funny anecdote that I'll add, but I didn't mean to cut you off. I want to add.
No, go for it.
So there's an interview, and I think it was fascinating to watch with Travis Dye, and I believe it was 24/7, the Go Ducks website there, where the reporter asked Travis Dye about the similarities between what it's like playing with Justin Herbert versus Anthony Brown, and you could see the wheels spinning in Travis Dye's head going, I'm not quite sure how I can get through this. Talked about the level of engagement, the competitiveness, how great Anthony Brown is a guy, and how more or less, and I'm paraphrasing of course here, how they go about their business very differently when it comes to leading an offense. So first off, I give Travis Dye a world of credit for knowing how to get himself out of that situation, and I also have to tip my hat to the reporter whose face you couldn't see, but I wonder if they could do that with a straight face when you compare a franchise quarterback in the National Football League to a guy that I'm not sure Mario trusts to throw the football in 3rd and 13.
So the reporter that asked this question, adult,
I'm going to guess a student reporter, but I don't know for sure because it's one of those angles where they have the microphone in front of Travis Dye. It's a 5-minute little stint, but you don't see the face and they don't necessarily share the reporter's name.
Yes. The other thing here is, Wazoo's got 2 weeks to prepare for this game and 2 weeks to prepare for an offense, as you mentioned, that is led by Anthony Brown, and he's not the most dynamic through the air. Let's see if they can do something schematically, right? You definitely want to load the box and force Brown to beat you with his arm rather than letting him be the extra man advantage in the ground game. That is a big if. You kind of mentioned how light Wazoo is in the trenches, and that's the reason they're 98th in defensive line yards through 10 weeks. They also lost their defensive line coach. When you look at standard downs, where Wazoo has to defend the possibility of run or pass, 54% of plays have graded successful against them. The Oregon offensive line, as I mentioned, is just very stout, although we talked off air, there is one guy potentially down this week, but they're a top 5 offensive line in terms of line yards created. They've only allowed 10% of runs to get stuffed at or behind the line of scrimmage. That's the best rate in the country. And so the Ducks are always playing in situations where run and pass are an option, which kind of makes Anthony Brown and some of his numbers even more kind of laugh out loud.
Oh, I was going to go less of a liability. You took the much more politically correct approach there.
Yes. So, basically what ends up happening and likely what transpires in this matchup is Oregon's going to be in a ton of second and medium and third and short because Oregon doesn't surrender negative plays. And again, Wazoo isn't big enough in the trenches. So metrically, you have a Wazoo defense that's 78th in early down defense, 79th on third and fourth down because they're not getting teams in uncomfortable situations. Opposing teams are living in short situations because Wazoo stinks on early downs. Oregon's top 15 in both EPA per rush and rushing success rate. So that is kind of the matchup to look for here, obviously. I mean, this is Washington State's Super Bowl, right? 2 weeks to prepare. They're going to come out fiery. They're going to load the box. They're going to fly around for the first half. You do wonder if they eventually wear down. And, this is kind of a bigger than the game moment, right? There's a lot of turmoil that's going on at Washington State. If they can somehow win this game and fight for a Pac-12 championship, it would mean the world to them, obviously. But here's what's kind of crazy.
The world to us, too, holding Utah tickets.
Yes. Here's what's, kind of nutty to me is, again, going back to, I don't really like a lot of teams in college football this year. Is I think Oregon stinks relative to where the College Football Committee has them ranked. I don't see value in laying 14 at all. But my number makes it 15. That's how bad the Pac-12 is. That I think the leader is wildly overrated, not even a top 10 football team. And still somehow the number itself is short when they're playing in conference. I mean, heading into the Arizona State game, Wazoo had been outscored on the season. They get the 3 early turnovers the first 11 minutes against ASU. They go on to win that game outright. Give them credit. They're now, after that game, a positive point differential on the season. But my number doesn't get me to where there's value in Washington State. But everything I am hearing, the text I received this morning, is that all signs point to Wazoo being the side here. Would you agree or disagree with that?
Oh, I 100% agree, and I think there are a variety of reasons here. When you look at Oregon, the one thing that we have grown accustomed to, and it's no fault of Mario Cristobal and the program in general, they play their best football in games that mean the most to them. They typically raise their level of play for the Ohio States of the world. We saw it on full display with their defense being fully engaged. We can say what we want about Washington, but that's a big rivalry, and that was a team that played pissed off defensively. Washington scoring 16 points was as misleading as you were going to find, with 9 of those points coming directly from the defense. And what does Oregon have waiting in the wings? Arguably their biggest regular season game and the biggest obstacle for them getting to the college football playoff, a trip to Salt Lake City, a game that'll most likely be played under the lights at Rice-Eccles Stadium. So who can fault Oregon, even a game within the league, a team on paper that they should dominate, if they don't come out and look like a well-oiled machine from start to finish against a Washington State team who doesn't wow you with anything they do, but they've played with heart, they've played with intensity, and this is a team that very easily could have let its season get off the rails, especially after week 1 when you lose outright to Utah State as a 17-point favorite.
Oh, it definitely feels like Washington State has come together internally, right? In terms of hey, the guys who are not here, they're not here anymore. Yep. We can either fold up or we can come together and rebuild the family and trust each other and get out there and play as hard as we can. And they are flying around. That is one thing. As soon as you kind of put on some of these games, they're undersized, they're not overly talented, but they play really, really hard. And so I would expect a pretty game effort here with what's on the line for them, right? You beat Oregon, you head to the top of the Pac-12 North. And so huge game for them. You could see them flying around early. Maybe that might be the angle rather than taking the 14 is looking first half plus 7.5 if they are the side.
You know what's interesting, and I don't want to spend time on it or even really delve into it. The unit that I've really struggled with for Oregon, I think we know what they are offensively. It's been easy to figure out. Defensively, I'd be lying if I said I understood what their identity was, other than teams being forced to scheme for Kevon Thibodeau, not allow him to create those disruptive havoc plays in the backfield. Because we've seen it with Cal, we've seen it in a number of games that you can attack this Oregon defense, and I'm very curious to see what Washington State, with 2 weeks to prepare and an underrated offensive line, will put together if it's a steady dose of Max Borghi or they allow Jaden Delora to try and throw it all over. But a fun game nonetheless, and one that, of course, has major implications, not only in the college football playoff, but, of course, the Pac-12 title race. Should have done this earlier in the show, but want to remind all of you, our loyal listeners out there, to follow Payne on Twitter at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Furman. You can follow me there. Most importantly, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. Be sure to rate, review, subscribe on Apple Podcasts to the Bet the Board podcast. Listenership numbers continue to trend in the right direction. We appreciate your continued support and loyalty for everything you guys have meant to us. And FanDuel wants to reward all of you guys. FanDuel.com/bettheboard. $1,000 risk-free bets, 30-1 enhanced odds. Plenty of ways for you to attack the college and NFL board. College basketball fully underway. We know that's Payne's real passion. NHL, you name it, NBA. It's all there right at your fingertips. One more game to go, Payne. You know we can't get through a week on this very fine podcast without paying attention to my beloved Mountain West. And we have a showdown taking place in Southern California this weekend where it's Nevada. On the road against San Diego State, you're looking at the Aztecs, a 2.5-point favorite at FanDuel Sportsbook. Total on this game sits at 46.5. In comes a San Diego State team fresh off of an ugly, and I mean ugly, 17-10 win in the Islands against the Hawaii Rainbow Warriors, but it may not have been as ugly as Reno outlasting San Jose State, winning with a game-winning field goal in the waning seconds, 27-24, despite closing a 10.5, 11-point favorite. The winner would move into sole possession of first place in the Pacific Division. The loser, well, it probably puts them behind the 8 ball, given that they have defeats against Fresno State. The Aztecs have said that's provided them extra motivation to potentially get over the hump, given they got a little bit of help last week from Boise State in that dominant performance in the Valley. The marquee player to watch in this game, Payne, it may not be Carson Strong. It may be San Diego State's all-world special teamers. And Matt Araiza, who had his 15th 60-yard punt of the season, setting an FBS record for a season with 60-yard punts, broke the record of Texas A&M's Brandon Mann back in 2018. He's averaging nearly 52 yards per punt. This guy can kick field goals. Hey, maybe he's a second-day NFL draft pick, given everything he brings to the table. But there's no doubt it's Carson Strong against the Aztecs defense in terms of what'll define who comes out with a victory in Carson, California.
That was a big punt to end the first half, I have to say. I enjoyed that punt thoroughly.
It is nice to have that luxury.
50
yards. Yeah, 50 yards on the fly and let it roll where it needs to go.
Listen, almost every Nevada game is going to come down to Carson Strong. Yeah, right. He's their horse. He plays the most important position. Seems obvious. Nevada doesn't really run the ball. Third most pass-heavy team in the country, and candidly, they probably couldn't run on San Diego if they tried. And so, basically it comes down to something we discussed when San Diego State played Fresno. And it's Nevada has to come out early, build a lead through the air. Very, very similar to what Fresno did. Can you execute it now? So that way it makes San Diego State play catch up and throw the ball on the other side. And to do that, Carson Strong has to be damn good. I can't figure out quite what he is. He's obviously very good for the Mountain West level. The knee issues concern me, right? The 8 screws to the knee, and sometimes, halfway through the game, he looks like Dan Marino out there. So that makes me nervous. But again, very good quarterback. We've had some question marks about San Diego State's secondary, despite some of the metrics and how they look, right? It looks fantastic metrically, like it's top 5 pass defense through 10 weeks. But San Diego State's faced one legitimate passing attack all season in Fresno. They lost that game by double digits. And if you look at the 8 other offenses San Diego State's played, 6 of them are outside the top 75 in EPA per pass. Those 6 have an average EPA pass rank outside of the top 100. The other 2 teams are FCS, Towson, and an option running team in Air Force. So they really have not been tested at all through the air. So, you're looking at metrics that look fantastic because of competition, but because they haven't faced offenses that truly want to throw that often, there are massive question marks still through 10 weeks. San Diego State's played backup quarterbacks multiple times as well. So, I think the question mark that we had coming into the season in the secondary is still a big question. We mentioned this in the Fresno game that they're 2 elite corners from a season ago and Hall and Thompson that were, all Mountain West first team conference guys. Life without them, what that looks like, really hasn't been answered. You also have some history for Carson Strong against San Diego State. He's played them 2 times. 2019, Strong started the game horribly, and then out of the break had 2 nice drives. 16 plays for 75 yards, 5 plays for 55 yards, both touchdowns. But his EPA per pass was just 0.043 for the game. Nevada scored 17 total points. Then last season, Carson Strong was good in the second and third quarters. That was enough to win and generate a 0.25 EPA per pass. Nothing spectacular. But San Diego State did a really nice job on passing downs against him last year, held them to a 17% success rate. Overall in that game, Nevada was a negative 9% in success rate and still managed to win. So, even though we're saying San Diego State hasn't been tested through the air defensively, Carson Strong really hasn't lit these guys up in the last 2 meetings, even though Nevada's kind of squeaked out some wins. If Nevada has a chance here, it's because Carson Strong builds a lead through the air, and then that makes San Diego State's offense uncomfortable. If that doesn't happen, San Diego State should be able to run the ball down Nevada's throat. Nevada's 120th in EPA per rush allowed. San Diego State, we saw make the switch to Lucas Johnson, a mobile quarterback, a few weeks ago. The interesting part about this game, and I don't know if you're watching the screen, Todd, but one of the sharper stops just moved San Diego State to -3. The line says San Diego State rolls here because looking at our numbers, Nevada would be -2.5 on a neutral. San Diego State plays its home games about 2 hours away from campus. The line move through 0 is not a ton, but you're still looking at like a 5-point move here based on where we would have this game versus where it is. It's very difficult for me, but the information I'm getting is that San Diego State is the side, even though it doesn't necessarily mesh with the number.
I've watched these teams probably more than I'm willing to admit. Obviously, living out here on the West Coast, paying a little bit more attention to the Mountain West in a slightly favorable time window late at night. And the one thing I will say from Nevada, they find themselves behind the down and distance an awful lot. And it's Carson Strong trying to make plays. I think against the defense that can be as complex and variable as San Diego State, finding yourself in 3rd and 7 more often than not will not be a recipe for success. I mean, they're in the 32nd percentile on 1st and 10 this year for Nevada. That shouldn't be the case when you have an NFL caliber starting quarterback, but when you're unable to run the football and you've had issues in protection, I think those things can rear their ugly head when you step up in class, even against this Aztecs defense that hasn't exactly been tested, to your point, by a legitimate living, breathing passing attack other than Jake Haener. One other thing I want to bring up, and this is only from watching the game. I haven't found an injury update. I haven't seen it on a screen anywhere else. I'm very curious if Cole Turner, the number 2 option in Nevada's passing attack and the safety blanket for Carson Strong, will actually be available for this game. He was the recipient of a cheap shot, a targeting, you can call it what you will. He was really unable to get himself up off the field under his own power late in that game against the Spartans. And Romeo Doubs hasn't looked like the same dynamic receiving threat this year as we've seen in the past. If Turner's out of the mix and not able to exploit the middle portion of the field, I know it's a skill position player in college football, but for me, Payne, that would be part of the reason that this number is slowly leaking out, despite anything major suggesting it should as far as the numbers are concerned.
And you were spot on with your initial assessment. Nevada right now, 119th in the country on 1st and 2nd down. So they are not bypassing 3rd down and early downs. They're actually 80th in early down EPA. We know they can't run. Nevada, 105th in EPA per rush. So again, this just comes down to Carson Strong being able to move the ball through the air Dobbs doesn't look like himself. Cole Turner potentially dealing with an injury. Not the greatest matchup. So just the whole game is on Carson Strong and how this plays out. And so that's a difficult way to kind of lean on a team here when it's just quarterback. It's a very important position, and he's got the ability at this level to, give San Diego State some issues through the air. But if that is not humming, you can certainly see why San Diego State matchup-wise is catching some steam here.
Yeah, and I think that's the biggest difference, too. I know a lot of people go, well, look, San Diego State really struggled when they faced the only vertical passing attack in Fresno State. The big difference in that matchup was you had Fresno State fans that actually attended. It was a 50-50 split. I'm not sure I can say the same about the Wolfpack. But more importantly, for Fresno State, they're significantly more balanced. They had two capable running backs. I know Ronnie Rivers didn't play in that game, but they were able to use the pass to set up the run. Nevada is going to look to try and throw the ball as much as any team in the country, especially when you look at how their ratio of run to pass is. I mean, this is a team that throws the ball well above the national average. We know it's an air raid type attack, but they've also dealt with protection issues. Not great for a quarterback whose knee often looks, to your point, like it's being held together by spit, bubble gum, and a little bit of paper mache. So fun game worth watching on the West Coast, 10:30 Eastern on Saturday night. You can follow Payne on Twitter at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Furman. Follow me there. The podcast at Bet the Board Pod. And if you haven't already done so, youtube.com, search Bet the Board. Subscribe to the Bet the Board pregame show. There's oftentimes a lot of interesting content there that we don't include in our Monday, Wednesday, or Thursday podcasts. So you always want some of the best betting nuggets so you're perfectly armed by the time you go to the window. We do have one final order of business, Payne, as we do on every single Wednesday and Thursday podcast. It's identifying a best bet and investment opportunity somewhere in the college football landscape. What do you have in store for us this coming weekend?
It's ugly. It's in the Big Ten, and it's going to be a meat grinder. But let's go with rotation number 127, the Minnesota Gophers, plus the 5.5. And I don't know if you've been paying attention to the screen, Todd, but while you were eloquently leading into one of the games, I was a pig, and we took the 6 out your way.
You son of a bitch. I couldn't even get down. I couldn't even get down on the 6.
I knew you played there. I had to beat you to the punch.
I'm waiting and watching because their app doesn't actually open till a little bit later. So I had about 4 or 5 minutes to go, and then I saw that number disappeared. I wasn't going to say anything on air, but thanks. I really appreciate it. Who needs enemies when you have friends like Payne Insider beating you to numbers?
So let's take the widely available 5.5 here. When I look at this game, you're looking at an Iowa team that is starting to turn into the team we thought they were based upon underlying metrics, right? They came out this year just on fire and winning games they probably weren't winning in the box score. They're doing it on a lot of smoke and mirrors. You win a game like Penn State, that's a game that, if Sean Clifford's there, you're going to lose by double digits at home. We've seen what this team's looked like the last month or so, and it's basically an underperformance on the road at Northwestern last week where you win by 5 as a double-digit favorite. Spencer Petras is out. In comes Alex Padilla. If you looked at him, kind of caught Northwestern off guard last week, but past the initial shock phase. Padilla had a negative EPA per pass in the third and fourth quarters.
He looked more like Vicente Padilla in the second half than he did a capable college football quarterback.
So, obviously, this is a rivalry game. Minnesota crapped the bed last week, but they have shown up on the road in some interesting spots this year. Their defense has been fantastic. 33% rushing success rate allowed. That's top 20 in the country. Iowa we've kind of mentioned, right, the offensive line not quite getting the push. So that's a spot where if you're down to Padilla, and if you're Padilla and you're not starting over Spencer Petras, probably tells you his ability. And so it becomes the Tyler Goodson game. Can you stop the run? Minnesota is equipped to do that. And I think in a game where you're looking at a total of 37, taking points is at the utmost premium. And so I think this has some value in the number. I think there's some matchups to like here as well. You have the more capable quarterback. You have the better ground game. You have the better run defense. And you're getting points with a total at 37 in a rivalry game. Just feels like the right spot here for Minnesota to bounce back after the Illinois loss.
Do you want me to see if I can arrange getting a small replica you can put on your desk of the Floyd of Rosedale trophy?
I'm going to pass. That is I think we discussed this. Is that a pig?
It is a pig. It is a pig trophy, one that I know folks in the Heartland hold near and dear to them. I'm not going to take any shots, but you're right. The total in this game at 37 does not suggest a whole lot in the way of offense. Let's hope we get good Tanner Morgan working in our favor for the Golden Gophers.
Yes. Yeah, I'm a big bacon guy, but we'll pass on the trophy. Hopefully Minnesota is taking that trophy home and they win this game outright and we don't need the points.
Oh, any other things, words of wisdom, nuggets, tidbits you'd like to pass on? I will say I think both of us watched the 2-hour season premiere of Yellowstone. We're both blown away by the energy and action. We're not going to provide any spoilers, but do we give it a thumbs up to start the new season?
Oh, that's 2 thumbs up. That was great.
So that's our show recommendation.
Did you dive into the other shows that you still haven't started Succession?
I have not started Succession yet.
And a show that we used to watch came back in
Which
Dexter.
Show? Oh, no, I actually never got into Dexter back in the day.
I never got into Dexter.
I never got into Dexter. I never got into Sons of Anarchy. I haven't taken those plunges. I will say, though, watching Yellowstone, I may get snookered into buying Paramount Plus with that whole origin story they're trying to sell me with Tim McGraw, Faith Hill, and pretty star-studded cast there. And then they have the new, the Mayor of Kingstown with Kyle Chandler and Jeremy Renner. I'm probably going to get suckered into the 37th streaming service that I don't already have.
Jeremy Renner is in movie star jail after making a couple stinkers. And so that is an interesting cast, though, with him and the old football coach from Dillon. Hey. I'm intrigued by that one.
So, I'll probably watch one episode. I'll go, this show sucks. I want my $5.99 back from Paramount Plus. But I also have to be careful. I can't take too many jabs since I think Paramount Plus subscriptions do help pay me given some of my CBS responsibilities as well.
There you go.
So
can't bite the hand that feeds you.
Nope, you definitely can't do that whatsoever. All right, we've done enough damage. We've broken down as many games as we can. I know you're anxiously counting it down to the end of the college football regular season because that's what Grinches do around these parts, despite our loyal listeners loving every bit of blood, sweat, and tears that go into the outstanding analysis you provide each and every week. Enjoy the full slate of college football this weekend. We continue to see the college football playoff picture take shape, but more importantly, our travels will take us to Iowa City and Kinnick Stadium. So with the Minnesota Golden Gophers ticket in hand come Saturday afternoon, hopefully we'll see you at the window.